Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of creatives and rock stars of life. My guest today is accomplished in many disciplines. He's an author, financier, philanthropist and conservationist. He's encountered giant jumping rats, golden-headed tamarins, monkey-eating eagles and many more of the world's rarest wildlife. He's raised more than £24 million for more than 220 conservation projects in over 80 countries. He's written books whose subject matter ranges from Gerald Durrell to the rogue trader Nick Leeson, to interviews with the likes of Indira Gandhi and Sir John Betjeman, to comparing two of our best-loved and highest-regarded female authors, Jane Austen and George Eliot. That's before we talk about his day job, working in financial services and founding and running his own fund, Whitley Asset Management, for 22 years. I'm looking forward to hearing what inspired him to do all these things and how he has managed to pull them all off so magnificently. In researching this conversation, I've been in awe, in tears, inspired and deeply moved. I'm really excited to be talking today to Edward Whitley OBE. Edward, thank you so much for being here.
Well, Katie, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
I'd love to start with you telling us a little bit about your family history.
Well, I was born in 1961, which was just 16 years after the end of the Second World War, which seems extraordinary now. And it seems to get closer and closer the older I get. And so my grandfather fought in the war and they cast a wonderful influence over us. So my grandfather was in a Lancaster bomber and he decided he'd be a rear gunner. So he never wanted to ask anyone to do anything that he wouldn't himself do. So he took on the most dangerous job because the rear gunners were those who were attacked first. But Grandpa survived his 60 sorties. Uncle Doug, another bomber, he was in bomber command. He was shot down, parachuted, on the run for a couple of days and then captured and put into Stalag Luft 3, the prison of war camp where the Great Escape took place.
Oh, wow.
And Uncle Roger was killed whilst training to be a pilot, so he would have probably died anyway. But that generation were just truly heroic. And then as I grew older, they all were inspirational influences to us.
Which of your relatives bought Paynton Zoo?
Well, that was great Uncle Herbert.
Okay.
The family moved to Paynton and you were brought up in Dartmoor, so you know it well. And
yes.
They lived there through the First World War and into the Second World War. And Herbert set up Paynton Zoo, which started off as a collection of domestic animals. He bought a shower horse for an unbelievable amount of money just before shower horses were replaced by tractors. Started off breeding magnificent racing pigeons and he won Crufts dog show. And then he went into more and more exotic animals. And that's where Gerald Durrell came in. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but Gerald Durrell supplied animals to Paynton Zoo to great Uncle Herbert. He was a very eccentric animal collector. And he gave pigeons to the war effort, to homing pigeons to be used by spies in France to release them back to carry messages. You parachute them down into France where they'd be picked up. And then you tie your message to the racing pigeon. The idea was the racing pigeon could get through the guns a little bit easier than someone trying to come on foot.
Wow, so that was his war effort.
That was his war effort. Growing up in Shropshire was a magical childhood and many of the same things, I'm sure, applied compared with your childhood in Dartmoor, which is it's a very long way away from London. It's very remote. You're left to your own devices, so you can have an idyllic childhood there. My sister Viv, she loved ponies. So at first she was given a donkey rather than a pony. So we used to go on donkey rides and then there's the donkeys to pull a cart. And then she did get some ponies. So we go off riding together and exploring all the Shropshire hills. And my brother Jeremy was a brilliant fisherman. So we'd go off trout fishing for hours on end. And you had that freedom, a freedom to explore nature and explore wilderness.
You were the middle child.
I was the middle child.
That place in your family, has that shaped you in any way?
They'll be the judge of that. I mean, I think being a middle child means you're a generalist. So you can play with both wings of the family. So I could go pony riding with Viv and trout fishing with Jeremy. And they were much better. I mean, Viv was a brilliant rider. Jeremy's a brilliant fisherman, but I could keep up with them a little bit. So it means you're a generalist. And that's always been what I've done in life is to be a generalist.
I think you're being very self-deprecating. You go on to St Anne's in Oxford and you get a blue for modern pentathlon, which is fishing and riding are 2 of the 5.
Well, fishing's not, but that would have been a good one. But
was it not? Sorry.
It would have been wonderful if it had been, but it's pistol shooting, running, swimming, riding and fencing. So
Okay.
I was able to shoot because Jeremy and I had air rifles, and I was able to ride, or at least no pony could really get me off very easy. So it was very difficult to dislodge. Then running and swimming, you just train very hard. And fencing, if you've read The Count of Monte Cristo, who doesn't love fencing?
Well, you must have been doing all of those things very well to win a blue for it. But why did you pick St Anne's and why did you choose English?
Well, English, I think I'd always loved. I'd loved storytelling. I'd loved reading books such as childhood books, Wind in the Willows, or in Shropshire, of course, reading Lord of the Rings, one summer holiday.
That's
you
perfect.
are in the Shire.
Yes.
And the children still call Shropshire the Shire.
Yes.
So you feel that that's where it was based. I'm sure lots of other people feel the same. And so I loved escaping into those worlds. And then St Anne's was just a brilliant college. They gave me a second chance when nobody else gave me a chance. So I'd spectacularly failed my A-levels. And so I'd been turned down by every university I'd applied to.
Oh, my goodness.
So in those days, you could do an Oxbridge exam after your A-levels. So
Yes.
St Anne's gave me that second chance. And there's an amazing tutor there called Dorothy Bednarowska who taught English, and I really wanted to be taught by her. So that was why it's St Anne's. I vividly remember my first essay. You have to read them out aloud to your tutor. It was to the redoubtable, if terrifying, Dorothy Bednarowska. It was on George Eliot, and I'd written a really lame essay. And there's just nothing worse than reading it out, and you know after page 2 that it's going to only get worse. And so for me, George Eliot was very unfinished business. So if my book is anything, it's a very, very late essay to Dorothy Bednarowska.
Was it about her books in general, or were you writing about a particular book?
It was meant to be about all her books, but Dorothy Bednarowska pointed out to me that I clearly had not read Adam Bede, Felix Holt, Romola, of course, or Daniel Deronda. And
that's right.
And she was right.
I think actually we're not alone, because I have a lovely friend of mine, Rick Saunders, who I gave your book to. And when I said I was going to be chatting to you and that you'd written this book, and he said, oh, well, I love Jane Austen. He said, but I just didn't think much of George Eliot when I was at university. I just really couldn't get on with him or her. And then when I saw him and gave him your book, he said, I've just started Middlemarch again. I can't put it down. So I think maybe at 18, we're just a little bit too young for it.
Also, their fortunes changed. I mean, in George Eliot's day, she was a top-selling author. When she became George Eliot, because she was Mary Ann Evans, Jane Austen in the mid-Victorian time was a rather forgotten Regency author who had died 35 years ago. Not many people had really heard of her. George Lewis, this is going to get a little bit complicated, but George Lewis had always loved Jane Austen and tried to get anyone who he met to write more like Jane Austen. And so when Mary Ann Evans decides to write fiction, takes his name of George, Christian name, and Eliot, who's the heroine of Persuasion. She's very influenced by him and writes a little bit like Jane Austen. And then she cuts completely loose and explores territory that Jane Austen was never going to explore. But in her day, George Eliot, her book Romola, Sight Unseen, was offered £10,000 for, which was more than any Charles Dickens novel ever went for. So she noted down in her diary that this was the biggest offer ever made. George Lewis noted down in his diary, this is the most magnificent offer ever seen for a novel. He was delighted. George Eliot thought it was too much, so she asked the publishers to reduce the offer because...
Gosh, that's very honourable of her.
For her, money was always a moral issue, so she thought £10,000 was too much, but £8,000 was more like it. And that was Romola. And now it's really totally unread. I mean, I believe it's a masterpiece, but it's very unread, and I came to that very late.
Am I right in saying, Edward, that you joined Rothschild straight after university?
Yes.
And so what made you decide to do that?
Well, it was a wonderful bank there, long-term family success. There's nothing like Rothschild's. They recruited generalists then. This might have changed by now, but then I read English and I asked them, well, is it okay to join if I've read English? And they said, absolutely fine. We've got people who've read history, PPE, classics. We can give you the maths. That's not a problem, but we want people who've got common sense.
How did you enjoy it?
It was wonderful. It was absolutely fantastic training. They're very small. They punch well above their weight. They advised the government on the privatizations in the 1980s. I mean, so suddenly you go from you're a tiny junior just started, and it's your job to pull together a large transaction with a whole room full of lawyers and accountants who are much better and everything than you are, but your job is to sort of run the show.
In amongst that time, you also wrote this wonderful book, The Graduates, and it was your first book and it won Private Eye Book of the Year. It's a series of interviews and they're all Oxford alumni, including Martin Amis, Richard Dawkins, Nigel Lawson, Indira Gandhi, Sir John Betjeman, Dudley Moore. And I had to think, gosh, this is very visionary of you, because here we all are now podcasting. And that's exactly what you were doing all those years ago. What gave you the idea to do this?
Well, it started off as an Oxford magazine. And so the magazine was going to cover lots of different subjects. And what I was given to do was to interview people. So I started off interviewing whoever would give me an interview.
But given that I spend time approaching people to say, will you please let me interview you? How was your approach?
Quite tenacious. I mean, those days I wrote letters. So you'd write letters to people asking for an interview. And I remember writing to Margaret Thatcher, who was then Prime Minister, quite a few times. And her press secretary, Bernard Ingham, finally replied going, "Dear Mr. Whitley, you must understand the pressures on the Prime Minister's time. Please stop writing." But other people I sent a telegram to if letters hadn't got through. A telegram then was a very good thing. So it was, "Please can I have an interview, stop. I'm in London next week, stop. Any chance, stop." I mean, so you knew a telegram would be delivered. Bunch of flowers with a note inside.
Oh, that's a good one.
Try that one, Katie.
That's a really good one.
But of course, everyone wants to come to be interviewed by you, so that's different. But I was very young and I tried to get more and more ambitious interviews. So we came down from Oxford. The magazine, of course, never materialised, but I had a whole collection of interviews with people and I was getting more and more all the time. So I'd written to Mrs. Gandhi in India and she finally wrote back saying she'd be prepared to be interviewed.
Okay, so where did you interview Mrs. Gandhi?
In Delhi.
Oh, so you flew to Delhi to interview her?
Yes.
And just you or with someone else?
I went with a friend and we were very nervous and we'd prepared so carefully, written down all sorts of complicated political questions about her career, and she'd been the most influential woman in the world. And so then we finally get into her offices and there's these two huge Sikh bodyguards outside her door and we're let in and we have quite a formal interview. And it wasn't going very well.
In what way was it not going very well?
Well, all my questions were so predictable and she was just giving stock answers as you would to a journalist who was asking boring political questions. So I put my list to one side and said, well, let's talk about something completely different. Tell me, how did you meet your husband? And she said, oh, yes, well, I met him at an anti-British campaign. And then I said, well, my friend was bitten by a monkey. Where she leapt up from her seat, she came round her desk, she bent down to make sure that the skin on Rebecca's leg hadn't been broken by the monkey bite. And then I said, God, this is, and she said, well, I have to cure everybody. Everyone comes to me with their problems, with their illnesses. I'm a great healer. And so the whole interview took on this absolutely different dimension. And we had a wonderful, personal, very moving interview. And in fact, it was the last interview she gave. She was one of the guards outside her door, assassinated her a month later.
Oh, my goodness. Was it a love story with her and her husband?
Oh, it was amazing. So they were at a rally and they were passing the flag, the Indian flag, from person to person. Each person who had the flag was beaten up by the police. And she was tiny and very frail. So she was very worried that when the flag got to her, she couldn't hold it up. And sure enough, she fell down. She was beaten up and suddenly she felt herself being picked up. And her husband had been sitting on the wall, had seen her falling down and had gone into the crowd, picked her up and rescued her. So when she came to, she was looking up into the face of Feroz, who became her husband.
Wow, that's very lovely. I desperately want to read that interview now, and how amazing that you got to see her and you flew to Delhi to do it. I mean, that's so wildly exciting.
Well, one thing led to another, because I interviewed Iris Murdoch, who had been with her as a contemporary in the 1930s. And so she gave it a perspective on Mrs. Gandhi. I interviewed graduates from Oxford who'd been there all through the ages. I interviewed John Schlesinger, Charles Sturridge. Charles Sturridge had just directed Bridesmaids Revisited. Age 28,
oh my gosh, yes.
Age 28, his first thing, he'd been given the job. 5 days later, he finds himself directing Laurence Olivier on his deathbed scene as Lord Marchmain in Bridesmaids Revisited.
Oh my goodness.
So all these people had extraordinary experiences, and I listened very carefully and learnt a lot about all their lives.
You have published this book at Rothschild. You're there for about 6 or 7 years, and then you decide to give up banking. And you write Gerald Durrell's Army, which I have read and I absolutely adored reading. And I feel I know Gerald Durrell really well, even because I watched him on television on the Durrells every Sunday evening. And because it's on television, it must be right. But he had a zoo in Jersey, which was a training centre. He had breeding programs there where animals on the brink of extinction would be sent to breed in captivity, and then be reintroduced. And you go around the world checking some of these projects. What were the steps that led to you making this big decision and meeting Gerald Durrell and changing everything?
Well, it had been in our family DNA to a certain extent, in as much as Uncle Herbert had set up Paynton Zoo, and there's a family connection that Jerry Durrell used to supply animals to Herbert.
And did you see Gerald Durrell quite a lot then during your childhood?
No, because the connection had gone rather cold. So meanwhile, my grandfather had set up in 1961 a charitable trust called the Whitley Animal Protection Trust. So he had funded that. So I'd become a trustee of that in 1988 with Viv and Jeremy. And we began to look around to see where we wanted to fund and what, in the world of animal protection, what was a viable way of funding nature conservation, the environment. And in those days, most nature conservation was primarily done by Western science and Western scientists who would go from America and Europe, and they would go to places like Brazil or go to Madagascar. And they would rather preach as to what was the best way of conserving nature. So the reason why I decided to go traveling and see what was going on the ground was to find out where that money was really going and was there a better way of doing it. And so when I went to Brazil or Madagascar, I'd meet people on the ground who were doing really impressive conservation work, but they were thwarted because money wasn't really coming through very efficiently, because it's very inefficient to have a big operation in the West.
Yes.
And the money finds it very hard to get through to the ground where it's really best used. So the more I traveled, the more people I met, the more I could understand the problems they were facing. And I think the turning point came when I was in Brazil and met one of Gerald Durrell's trainees called Claudio Padua. And Claudio had been a very successful businessman in Rio. And then he himself had a great change of mind, and he'd left business and he decided to go back to university. He trained to be a scientist. He went to Durrell Institute and he did that course. And he took his wife and family to live in the forest, and they were looking after lion tamarins, which were then the most endangered mammal in the world, pitifully few numbers. And so when I met Claudio, I talked to him about, well, how can I best help here? And he pointed out that conservation biology was not being taught in South America. There's no university courses at all. So they all had to go to America to get those qualifications. So we decided to try and empower people in their own countries to the extent that was possible. And so that really became the germ of what's now known as the Whitley Fund for Nature. But that's jumping ahead quite a bit. So with Gerald Durrell's army, one of the highlights was going to Madagascar, in fact, with Gerald Durrell. And that was one of his last great animal collecting trips. Now, this was years ago, so those don't happen anymore.
What made Gerald Durrell so special?
He's a brilliant storyteller, and he finds fantastic ways of communicating with people. And so whatever you're doing, if you're doing nature conservation, you've got to be able to communicate with people. And then we'll come on to David Attenborough. I mean, these are amazing communicators.
Yes.
And so in Madagascar, we found ourselves, and Jerry was saving lemurs from extinction. So he was collecting lemurs to bring them back to Jersey to breed them in captivity. But he got rather ill when we were staying in Alouatra, and we'd been in a hotel, and his hotel bedroom was full of lemurs. I mean, there were 30 or 40 of them, and he was feeding them, and we were going to the markets and we were buying lychees and pineapples and feeding these lemurs. But then Jerry had to be flown back to the capital because he got badly ill and left me with these lemurs to bring back. And his sort of parting words were, "Edward, you'll be fine, just bring them all back on the train." And so just like Jerry would have done 20 years before, you end up getting lots of people to help you. So there's just always crowds of people wondering, what are you doing here? And so it's like, okay, well, this is a strange one, but we've got a whole box of lemurs to bring back, and how can you help? So everyone swung into action.
Did they breed in captivity?
Jerry was particularly gifted. I mean, he had an absolute empathy with animals, with all animals really. And he would say, I'd happily spend an hour on a bench watching a snail or a slug because they can just always teach you something. So he had this extraordinary empathy. And so the lemurs, he looked after them and nurtured them, and they bred well in captivity. And then there's a program to try and reintroduce them. Reintroducing is much more difficult because there's lots of questions about, are you displacing a natural population or will they adapt? And the Jersey ones do better than any others. I remember asking for a sabbatical at Rothschild's, and the managing director sat me down and said, "Edward, normally people work here for about 20 years before they talk about a sabbatical."
But he allowed you to have one?
He did.
And then you never went back?
Well, I did go back.
Oh, did you?
I did go back. And then I left again. They were absolutely wonderful. They still are an absolutely wonderful bank.
So some people would say, well, species come and go. It's just the way things go. Who cares? So why should we care?
Oh, that's a really good question, Katie. I mean, I suppose we just care about life on Earth, and we're a small but very, very intrusive part of it. And the rate of extinction of animal species has just never been higher. And the destruction we see around us is so great. And the reason why I set up the Whitley Fund for Nature, which was really born out of Gerald's army, was thinking about the world that my children were going to inherit. And so I'm sure, like you, when our first child was born, when Ella was born, and then Honor, Josie and Ned, you just think, well, I've got to do something to protect the beautiful world that I was lucky enough to grow up in. And in the UK, you'll remember fireflies.
Yes.
We remember the croaking of frogs in the village ponds, and they are all under serious threat. It was my effort to try and do something to protect the world and really try and protect the world at the grassroots level. So what I tried to do with the Whitley Fund for Nature is set up a mechanism whereby the money goes directly to the ground. So we have a very low UK overhead, very low, small UK office. And it goes to where it's most needed. It goes to where the biodiversity is highest. And it goes to where the conservation effort will be long-lasting and sustainable. So what I didn't want to do was to fund Western scientists who get parachuted in, and they might come and they might go, and their message might or might not stick. What I wanted to fund was long-term local conservation. And they have an understanding of their community, which we just, as outsiders, just don't have.
It struck me as a bit like did you ever play that game Jenga or the bricks with your children? And that if you're taking all those sort of species out, a bit like those Jenga bricks, then they all perform some kind of important function.
Yes, and you don't know what. And then the most unlikely one, you pull that one out and the whole tower collapses.
Yeah.
So everyone knows that the need is very great. Climate change is happening in our lifetime. And you look at glaciers, you look at water levels, you look at the weather. These are happening. I've always tried to address things which are in our scope to try and address. So climate change is a macro topic which other greater organisations are tackling. And what we try and do is fund local conservationists working on the ground in their communities.
You're doing the most amazing, amazing job. So you set up the Whitley Fund for Nature, I think, in 1993, off the back of Gerald Durrell's army and going around the world and seeing all these different projects and what's working well and what isn't. I've been lucky enough to attend quite a few of your award ceremonies, and the last one was 2 weeks ago at the Royal Geographic Society. 6 winners each receive £50,000 for their projects, and the gold winner wins £100,000. And this year the gold award winner was Dr. Olivier Nsengimana, who is protecting the grey-crowned crane in Rwanda, which was heading towards extinction. And in just 10 years, with your support, he has managed to quadruple the numbers of grey-crowned cranes. How has Olivier managed to do this?
Well, it's a classic conservation success story. And also, if you think of the backdrop to Rwanda, he's so moving because you pointed out that as a child, all children have got heroes that they grew up with, superheroes, and whether it's Wonder Woman or Batman or all these superheroes that you aspire to. And he said, obviously, I was growing up in Rwanda, I had no television, so I had no idea of any superheroes, but my superheroes were the cranes. And I just wanted to be able to fly like them. And then he said, I realized as I was growing up, there were fewer and fewer of them. And the only way you could see them was actually in captivity. They'd been kept for the pet trade with their wings clipped. So he decided that his superheroes, the cranes, needed his help. So it comes down to the passion of one person on the ground in their community. And so he decided to ask people not to capture cranes, release them into the wild. Nature needs just a bit of space. Ideally, it needs a lot of space, but rather than having no space and clear-cut land, fragments, nature will work its way through corridors and will bounce back if given half a chance. So Olivier's built up the crane population painstakingly, has got more and more people involved, has got a campaign going in Rwanda to save the cranes. People inherently love nature. They want a success story. So time and again, across all our winners, we can talk about Panima in Assam with her Hargilla storks. As a young woman, Panima saw one tree being cut down with a stork's nest in it, and she picked up the stork chicks, which were otherwise going to die. And she said, how can you cut down this tree? Look at these stork chicks. And she looked after them and then released them into the wild. So gradually, I was going to say fast forward, but of course you can't do this very quickly, but gradually over time, from being born in a village by the river in Assam in absolute obscurity, saving one stork, Panima has got a program together where she now has 20,000 women who are involved in stork conservation. She goes into villages, she goes into every ceremony. There's a lot of cooking involved, there's a lot of weaving, a lot of music, a lot of dancing, a lot of celebration of life and of nature. And the stork population has recovered. Panima was chosen this year as one of Time magazine's Women of the Year. So this is an incredible accolade for her, and rightly deserved, because her story is an extraordinary story of continuing to inspire people just to think and allow nature a little bit of room in their lives.
I'm going to mention some of the other winners. In this year alone, you had the Connecting Landscapes for Bornean elephants in Sabah, creating canopy corridors for the brown spider monkeys in Colombia, safeguarding medicinal plants in Nepal, conserving jaguars in Iguazu National Park, conserving the biodiversity of the Somancura Plateau, saving the Javan gibbon. I mean, it's so impressive, and particularly whenever it does seem like doom and gloom everywhere. And these are kind of projects, are sort of beacons of hope. And one of the things that I took away was that they're really bringing the communities along with them, putting everybody on the same team. And at the same time as you're saving, whether it's animals or whatever you're saving, with the grey-crowned crane, you are saving wetlands as well. So many species are being saved. It just keeps winning.
Well, you're right. I mean, nature conservation, the support can come from the most unlikely sources. So, for example, in Brazil, I mentioned Claudio Paggio, one of the early movers in conservation. Well, one of his protégés was called Larry Cullen, and Larry, as a young man, wanted to join the work that Claudio was doing, but his father was a dentist. And his father said to Larry, "Why are you wasting your time wanting to be a conservationist? Why, you should get a decent job, you should be a dentist like me." Larry said, "No, I want to work with Claudio." So they had a big family bust up, and Larry goes to work with Claudio. And there's a movement in Brazil back then called sem terra, which means without land. And all the landless people were invading the estates which were owned by absentee landlords, and they were destroying the forest. So Claudio and Larry were the first people to talk to the sem terra political party, which was a massive movement across Brazil. And they were saying, well, what sort of landscape do you want to live in? Because at the moment it's just clear cut and all destroyed. And the sem terra leaders said, well, tell us, what should we do? We want to plant fruit trees, we want to plant forests, we want to have a landscape which is a more natural landscape. So Larry started using jaguars as landscape detectives on the grounds that if you know where a jaguar is going, you can understand the landscape a bit better, and you can replant trees along those corridors. So Larry did a massive tree planting campaign. Meanwhile, his father was still saying, "Larry, why are you wasting your time? I don't understand this." Finally, towards the end of his life, there's a moment where they catch a jaguar and they get a radio collar it. And so everyone is watching. And Larry says to his father, "Dad, come along and just watch me, because there's a jaguar which we need to radio collar." And his father very reluctantly came and watched Larry in the forest with this jaguar. And this jaguar's been caught and it needs to be sedated and then radio collared. And after Larry's done all this and everyone bursts into applause, his father finally says, "Larry, I really understand why you're doing this." And then 2 weeks later, Larry, we give him our gold award. But his father has died just the week before.
Oh, wow.
He goes to receive the award, but he heard that Larry had won the gold award just before he died. So his father died a very happy man, and they had this extraordinary reconciliation. And so Larry is still working with Claudio. There's now a third generation working with the lion tamarins. So one of our winners last year is also working on the highly endangered black lion tamarins. I mean, they're still highly endangered, but they're still hanging in there in fragments of forest with corridors now connected. So the jaguars lead the way in terms of showing where you might replant forest. The tamarins are bouncing along at the sort of canopy level. So you can bring wildlife back, and the support for that can come from landless people who might think, well, why would they care? But the answer is, if you understand your community well enough and work with them closely enough, there is hope.
These conservationists, they are so impressive, and listening to them, they have such vision, purpose, conviction. And then looking at you, Edward, I mean, you were making such a difference to the world. You went around the world, you had this idea. There must have been times when you thought, what am I doing? I'm hitting my head against a brick wall. But you carried on. For those of us who think we might have an idea, but think, well, it's never going to work, so we won't even start, I have 3 questions for you, which is, did you have doubts? And did you ever think of giving up? And if so, how did you get yourself over that hump and continue?
Well, yes, certainly always had doubts. And I think the answer really comes in the value of partnerships. And something I never really expected was how many people would step in to help once we got going. So it was a tiny operation when I founded it with just 1 award and a small amount of money. But we wanted to try and attract support. And so David Attenborough immediately came on board to help. And after a few years, I got a call from someone I'd never heard of called James Teacher, who said, I've heard about this award you're giving. Is there room to give a second award? I said, well, absolutely, let's meet. And then John Lang came along. And then for the last 20 years, I've been working with Catherine Folks. And Catherine has brought so many people to the charity. And so the numbers involved have increased on our side of the donors who support the work of the winners. And we try and keep our overheads very tightly controlled, so the donors who are supporting the work feel very closely connected to the winners. And I think if you have doubts and want to give up, the inspiration comes from both the winners who are doing the work on the ground and also the donors who are so determined to keep funding from here. And it's that connection which is so very vibrant. When the winners have won, they feel like they've joined a family network, and they come to London for a week. We give them a lot of training, and Catherine Folks opens the house, and the winners meet all our donors, and they say, well, this is absolutely extraordinary, because normally when we win an award, it's all very institutionalized and we don't get to know the people who are behind the funding. We just get the funding. We might or might not get repeat funding, but with us, we invite people into our homes and into our lives, and they say they feel that it's part of a wider family. And the whole family has grown up with my parents and my children and my grandparents who set up the original charity. And that feels a very strong bind between us all. And the winners then go back to their own countries and they receive extraordinary attention. So we wanted to give them publicity. Princess Anne is our amazing patron who's come to our award ceremony every year without fail for over 25 years now, since she's been our patron. And so they have a film about their work, which David Attenborough used to narrate. So he kindly gave us his most precious gifts, which is his time and his voice. Princess Anne would give the prizes. And so they'd be armed with your own mini documentary about your work by David Attenborough. You'd be armed with a picture of you with Princess Anne. One of our winners from Argentina was on the way back home. He had to go via Madrid. He was just in the plane on the flight to Madrid, and the air steward was serving out drinks. And she said to him, I feel like we met before, I'm sure. Have we met? And he said, no, I don't think so. She said, no, we definitely have. He said, I really don't think so. And then a little while, she came back with a newspaper, and he was this little picture of him on the front corner of this newspaper, which is the National Argentinian newspaper. And she said, this is you. I knew I'd seen you before. What's all this about? And he said, well, I've just won this prize in London. And she said, oh, what are you doing with Princess Anne? Oh, well, she was giving the prize. And so a few minutes later, on the tannoy on the airplane, there's an announcement. This is your captain speaking. We have a very special guest on board. Pablo Bordino. He's won this prize. Anyway, the whole plane cheers, and he feels absolutely on cloud 9.
That's fantastic.
Then he arrives in Madrid, and he's got to change planes, and he gets to the boarding gate, and he's going onto the plane, and they say, we're so sorry, Mr. Bordino, your ticket's no longer valid. I'm afraid you can't get this ticket. And he says to himself, well, the fat lot of good that was, and his whole bubble's been punctured. And they say, well, you can use this ticket instead, which is a first-class ticket. So he's now flying first class back to Argentina. The same thing happens. On the loudspeaker comes this announcement. We've got Pablo Bordino on board. He's won this amazing prize. The whole plane this time is full of Argentinians flying back to Buenos Aires. So they are set to celebrate properly. So he arrives back in Buenos Aires, feeling the worst of where he gets to the airport. He sees there's a whole lot of reporters with camera crew and microphones waiting. And he thinks, my God, maybe Maradona's on the flight with him. So he looks over his shoulder. And then suddenly they all come running towards him. Mr. Bordino, you won this prize in London. What's going on? What are you doing with Princess Anne? And so he tells the story again. And then he gets home, and then later he gets a call from the president's office saying, the president has seen that you've won this prize. He wants to find out, what are you doing in London? What's Princess Anne? So he goes and meets the president. And
wow.
So that just shows the power of a photograph. And if you get the story right, and only Princess Anne could have pulled that off. So it's a chance for Pavlik to talk about his work to a wider audience that he would have ever got.
Absolutely. I think the next generation question the work that the royal family do. So that is an absolute example of how what they do has such an impact.
It has an amazing impact because they're impartial and so experienced, and they really understand the challenges that all our winners are going through, and they engage on a very nitty-gritty basis.
Yeah. Well, the Whitley Fund for Nature has now given £24 million to 220 environmentalists in over 80 countries. You've been going for 32 years now. But at the celebration of 25 years of the Whitley Fund for Nature, Kate Humble interviewed Sir David Attenborough, who is 99 this week. She asked him why, of all the conservation charities, he chose yours. He said it so well, and you're so humble, you won't say. These were his words.
Because 25 years ago, it was an extraordinary thing that one man should decide that he was going to do something himself. He wasn't going to tie himself with anybody else. He had a very clear vision. And he said, I will do it. And he gave up his career elsewhere, which was certainly beckoning him and certainly had great opportunities in order to do this. And he did it with one idea in mind, and that is that there are in the world individuals who have a vision and a passion, and no amount of organizations or rules or models can replace the passion of one man who is dedicated. And there's a kind of symmetry in this, in that he also saw that it's no good people sitting here telling people over there what to do, but there are equally people like him or her who equally have that sort of passion and who are dedicated to looking after the natural world, often focused on one particular species, but dedicated. And it is that parallel between him determined to get the wherewithal to do this in order to give those individual people the wherewithal to do it. Very simple, but very powerful. And I thought, this is a man who has a mission, and anything I can do to help him, I would certainly do.
You are such a slim organisation, and every bit of money that's raised is going out into the field where it is needed.
That's what we try to do. I mean, it's like that old Heineken advertisement, which, you know, the beer that reaches the parts that other beers can't reach.
Yes.
But David Attenborough is so inspirational. And once again, this year, all our winners cited him as the reason why they went into conservation. And people around the world have seen David Attenborough documentaries. The films are so brilliant and engaging, and they just make people want to care about things. The one time which I was really wrong-footed by David was when he used to host our ceremony, and the lectern up on the stage, the whole show would be written out, including the various speeches which were to be given. So my speech was in the ceremony to be turned over. So David was introducing the ceremony, and then I was on the front row waiting to be called up to speak, feeling sort of very nervous. And I noticed that David was going into my speech. He then delivered my speech, which I'd written without realising it. And of course, he did it brilliantly. All the best jokes, arm left, everyone loving it. And he just went through the whole speech. And I was thinking, okay, this is quite interesting. I'm not sure what I've got left to say here. And then he got to the end. And then it was, and I'd like to thank Her Royal Highness Princess Anne. I'd like to thank Sir David Attenborough. So he paused at that point and said, and I'd like to invite Edward to come up on the stage to say a few words. So It's like, David, I've really got nothing to say.
Oh my goodness.
So, but seeing David give your own speech in his own inimitable way is a very chastening experience.
Whitley Fund has been set up. You're running it. You then go from endangered species to a dangerous trader. And that was Nick Leeson. And you co-wrote Rogue Trader, or did you actually write it?
Well, it's called ghostwriting. So you write pretending to be somebody else. For those who don't know, Barings Bank was a wonderful old bank, rather like Rothschild, that had funded railways across Africa and railways across America and railways across India. It was a great Victorian institution, and it went bust because there's a trader called Nick Leeson based in Singapore who got into trouble and tried to trade his way out of it, and it went all against him and ended very badly wrongly.
Yes, and he ended up losing $1.4 billion, and he was responsible for their collapse, and he went to jail for 4.5 years.
Yes.
And then they made a film, which I watched, with Ewan McGregor playing Nick Leeson. So how did you become a ghostwriter for Nick?
Well, I was asked to do it because I had done some journalism and I'd worked at Rothschild's, and he fled from Singapore and he got as far as Frankfurt before he was caught. And then he asked for a lawyer, and the lawyer said, well, you need to write your story. And that's the only way you've got of paying your legal fees for a start. As it happens, they call my agent. And Mark said, I think Edward can help here because he understands finance. So they wanted to write a book which was readable, covered all the finance, but also told the story. And so that's how it came about. And Nick Leeson was in prison in Frankfurt, and then he never made it back to the UK. He was sent back to Singapore.
How did you communicate with him?
Just in Germany. In those days, he had very limited access. I think he could use a couple of pages of a fax machine. But it was a tremendous tragedy and a tale of everything which could have gone wrong went wrong, like all these big accidents. And in those days, Barings in London, I'm sure there are far better controls in place now, but Barings were very blindsided by what was going on in Singapore. And it appeared that it was all going swimmingly well, whereas in fact it was not. People are under terrible pressure in the financial world to try and show good results. And so he made a mistake and it was a bad result and he tried to cover it up. Wow. It's just a moral fable. You just have to confess immediately what you've done and just get on with it. Whereas he tried to cover it up and it just got worse and worse. And what was a small problem became a very large problem, and then an even larger problem, and then it completely blew up.
In the film, you do feel very sympathetic towards him, but all those people who lost their jobs.
There's a terrible accident.
It's
you
tough.
feel very sorry for everybody. You feel very sorry for him, for the pressure he was put under. You feel very sorry for the Barings Bank. You feel very sorry for everyone involved in it.
You also write Richard Branson's biography.
Well, he's another story of someone who has inspired lots of people to set up their own companies, and he's a great communicator. And lots of people say it was Richard Branson who inspired me to set up this company, this company, this company. There are stories about people in extraordinary situations, whether it's an unfortunate, tragic situation like Nick Leeson or whether it's Richard Branson. They're both doing extraordinary things, and it's how you react and work your way through the labyrinth.
Yes.
That sort of crazy labyrinth that we all got to work through.
Having been out of the financial world for 12 years, you then decide to set up Whitley Asset Management. What made you decide to do that?
I think that we had quite a young family. I was aware that I could either carry on being a writer, but it might not be a very secure existence. And so I thought I ought to go back to the city and get a job. So I did talk to a few people about the possibility of getting a job, and it very quickly became clear to me that after being away for a few years, I was completely unemployable. I felt like Rip Van Winkle trying to get another job. So I thought, okay, this is not going to work. So the only thing to do was to set up my own firm, and then at least I knew I had a job. So again, talk about partnerships. I set up the company with a fantastic partner called Louise Retty, and Louise and I worked together happily for over 30 years. And Louise had all the qualities that I didn't have, which is to say she was an accountant, she was a lawyer, she was absolutely rooted in reality. So all the ideas that I might have, she could quickly bring them down to earth and knock them into shape. And then we could see which one was the good and which one was the bad idea.
And you ran it for over 2 decades and sold it last year to Schroders Cazenove.
That's absolutely right.
I'd love us to move to your latest book, which is Jane Austen and George Eliot, The Lady and the Radical. What set of circumstances led you to write this book?
Well, this was rather unfinished business from my days of studying Jane Austen and George Eliot at university. And so I felt I had to go back. And what happened was during COVID, during the lockdown, I decided to escape into my favourite fictional worlds created by these magnificent authors. So I reread Shakespeare, which doesn't take as much time as you might think it does. You can do a play a night.
Yes, I suppose you can, because of course you watch a play a night, so you could read it.
Exactly. So Shakespeare's not as long as you might think. Then next favourite author, obviously Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, and then a toss-up between Charles Dickens and George Eliot. And because George Eliot was rather unfinished business at university, it had to be George Eliot. And so I started writing notes about it because I'd been given by one of my clients, I'd been given a wonderful leather-bound notebook, which had the rather provocative inscription on the front cover. It said, "Brilliant ideas, profound inspirations, and a list of my favourite clients." So Ellen, who gave me this book, obviously topped the list of favourite clients. And then the notebook looked across at me for quite a long time from my bookcase to my desk. And I was reading Jane Austen and George Eliot, and I became increasingly drawn to them. And so I started writing notes in this notebook. And then in lockdown, I was with Ella and Ned in Shropshire. Our other daughter, Honor, who'd read English at university, she was in Paris with her then boyfriend, Hubert.
Now fiancé.
And so I began to send emails to Honor with my thoughts about these two authors. And Honor was very patient and didn't seem to mind, and in fact was very encouraging. It was a great way of talking about these two authors, because what a crazy idea. I thought that lockdown in Paris with her boyfriend, what else was she want to do but to read emails from her father about George Eliot? So I began to assemble lots of notes and thoughts and reflections, and gradually I realised I had a manuscript of some sorts on my hand. So I gave it to a couple of friends to read, Victoria and Sigrid, and they said, "You do realise we're talking about a book here." So very excitedly, I phoned up my agent, Mark Lucas, who I hadn't spoken to for 30 years, since the days of Richard Branson,
Wow.
Nick Leeson, and Mark had done all those amazing SAS heroic books of Bravo 20 and all these Tornado Down. So he was very well used to dealing with these big bestsellers. So I said, "Mark, I've written this book. Great. What's it about?" "It's about Jane Austen and George Eliot." I was like, "Okay, I'll see what I can do." And what Mark so brilliantly did was make one phone call, and he phoned Alan Sampson, who was an absolutely fabulous editor, and Alan agreed to take it on. And so Alan did an amazing job of rearranging all the bits of the furniture. And then I worked very closely with Laura Palmer, who was the head of fiction at Heather's Use. And she helped us work on the energy and the zest and the personalities. And it's a wonderful thing when writing, which starts off as a solitary activity, becomes a team event, and everyone else starts helping, and it comes to life. You can see it coming to life absolutely off the page. And then suddenly you realise you do have a book, and it's going to be a really good one.
Well, as I told you before, I started with some trepidation because having never read George Eliot, and I have heard of Middlemarch and Silas Marner, but I'm not even sure I even knew they were by George Eliot. I did grow up reading Jane Austen and Enid Blyton and Agatha Christie, and I was a little bit worried about reading this book, that it was going to be too academic for me. But I happened to start it when I was at a doctor's surgery waiting for my appointment, and your prologue was so exciting, shocking, and you tell the story so brilliantly of how Marianne Evans meets George Lewis at Burlington Arcade, which I know. So when my appointment, I was finally called, I was really fed up because I was having such a lovely time reading the prologue. I didn't want to stop. So could you preface your brilliant prologue and talk about that meeting?
Well, it was a highly charged meeting. So we know when it was, 6th of October, 1851. 1851 is the year of the Great Exhibition in London. So London's swarming with tourists coming to see the Great Exhibition. And this is the last week of the Great Exhibition. And then George Lewis and Marianne Evans coming from different directions. And she has just arrived in London. So she's a young, scholar. She's self-taught. She's grown up in the Midlands. The only thing she's done is she spent 2 years translating a German treatise called The Life of Christ. To do that, she's had to teach herself Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and German. So she's an absolute scholar, and she's very young. She's come to London with no money and just trying to get a job. She's just been appointed the assistant editor of the Westminster Review. And then on the other hand, there's George Lewis, who is a bohemian man about town. He was the son of an itinerant French poet. He knocked up in London. He becomes a friend of William Thackeray, Thomas Carlyle, Charles Dickens. He acts with Charles Dickens in The Merchant of Venice. He plays Shylock. He's written a novel. He's a jobbing freelance journalist, up for anything, and the life and soul of any party. And so these two meet in this bookshop. And in Burlington Arcade then, ground floor looks very similar to how it looks now, in lots of smart shops selling nice bottles of scent, and in those days gloves and silver. And upstairs across the whole of the first floor is a line of brothels where the prostitutes upstairs advertise their availability by hanging black stockings out of the windows. And the shops on the ground floor make really good sales from the customers impulsively going upstairs. George Lewis and Marianne Evans meet in Jeff's bookshop, number 15, which is not a bookshop anymore, but the people at that shop know all about it.
Oh, do they? I really want to go back to Burlington Arcade and just actually be in the spot.
Now it sells silk ties, but they knew all about it being a bookshop, and they knew all about George Eliot, George Lewis, George Eliot, Marianne as was. And George Lewis loves Jane Austen. He's always loved Jane Austen. He tries to get everyone he can find to write more like Jane Austen. So what's happened for him in the last 3 years is he's had a long correspondence with an unknown author called Currer Bell, because he's been given this book called Jane Eyre to review, and it's by Currer Bell, and it's an unknown author. So he writes to this unknown author, advising this author, slightly patronisingly, to write more like Jane Austen. So Currer Bell is, of course, Charlotte Bronte, and she's been brought up in the Yorkshire moors, and she's never heard of Jane Austen like anybody else then, apart from George Lewis. She tells him she goes to a circulating library, she gets a copy of Pride and Prejudice, and basically she's thinking, hang on, why should I write like Jane Austen? I've written Jane Eyre, I've invented Rochester, my sister Emma's written Wuthering Heights and Heathcliff. I mean, Jane Austen...
it's so much more tumultuous and twisted.
They talk a lot about Jane Austen, and I think in the bookshop, George Lewis would have said, Jane Austen, what do you think of Jane Austen? That would be his first line of attack when he's talking to any potential journalist or writer. They meet and they start a relationship quite quickly. It's slightly veiled, but they're clearly very attracted to each other. And she commissions him to write an article about lady novelists. So of course, he writes his article talking a lot about Jane Austen. And then they basically elope. Now, George Lewis, in fact, can't get married again because he's already married and he's living in a commune, an open marriage. So he's got 2 children by his wife and then his best friend, Thornton Hunt, who goes on to become the first editor of The Spectator and The Telegraph. He has a child with George Lewis's wife. In fact, he goes on to have 4 children with her. But because George Lewis adopts the first child, he basically condones their adultery, and therefore they can't cite adultery, which was one of the things you could have cited as reasons for a divorce.
Okay.
So George Lewis can't get divorced from Agnes, so he can't remarry. He and Marianne go to the continent together, and they catch a night steamer and they steam across through the night to Antwerp. And she knows she's going to get ostracised because that's what Victorian society did.
Yes, because people would be judgmental about that today, but they were going to be really judgmental about that back then.
For a long time, she can't go back into society. But she and George are so happy, she really doesn't care. And she's such a radical and she's so modern. And the fantastic symmetry of the book is that Jane Austen was born in 1775, so she's got one foot in the 18th century, and she's an absolute Regency icon. I mean, in her day, the ships, take the Battle of Trafalgar, these were men of war ships built of oak with billowing sails. By the time George Eliot dies in 1880, these ships are ironclad destroyers. The army's completely changed. So life had changed through the course of the 19th century, and the Great Exhibition in 1851 is absolutely the pivotal point. So George Eliot then looks ahead, and she influences all the 20th century writers, Virginia Woolf and everyone and she takes all the happy endings that Jane Austen builds up her books to, and she breaks them apart and explores that very difficult psychological territory that lies beyond it. So in her first 2 books, George Lewis acts as an agent, obviously sending them to a publisher. saying these are the best things since Miss Austen. Because he can't help himself but recommend this as a sort of strength because it's so like Jane Austen. But by the third book, the third short story, which is Janet's Repentance, what happens there is that Janet is an alcoholic. She lives in terror of her husband. One night he smells alcohol on her breath and he beats her up and throws her out of the house. And this is obviously territory which Jane Austen was never going to go near. And that is very shocking at its day, very shocking to read now. And her first full-length novel is about a young woman who's seduced. And actually, whereas Jane Austen would probably leave the story at that point on the grounds that she didn't want to go any further, with George Eliot, she follows that story. And the woman who's seduced by the local squire's son becomes pregnant. And then the local craftsman, Adam Bede, asks her to marry him. And she feels she has to marry him. But as her pregnancy develops, she's trying to conceal it. And she's under more and more pressure. Finally, she runs away, tries to find Arthur, who seduced her. But he's disappeared, so she can't find him. She walks across a desolate landscape, gives birth in a field, and then murders the baby. And so this is very, very
really grim,
harrowing to read. And it was an absolute bestseller in its day. It reprinted 8 times. It made a reputation. And from then on, George Lewis, in fact, stops suggesting that she writes like Jane Austen. And she wrote as George Eliot. And she wrote 7 magnificent novels. And she was the great bestseller of her day. And it's interesting, their stars have slightly gone in different directions. So now Jane Austen, and you are the dream target, Katie. Everyone loves Jane Austen. She's an absolute icon.
Yes.
She's on the back of £10 notes.
Yes.
We just all love Jane Austen's world. George Eliot, a little bit more difficult and not as popular as Jane Austen anymore.
No, although they are still in the top 10 of most popular books ever.
When the BBC last did a poll of international critics to choose the best British novel ever written, in the top 20, Jane Austen has 3 of hers in the top 20, which is a staggering achievement. The Bronte sisters are both in the top 5, so Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre in the top 5. And the novel which was voted the best British novel ever written was Middlemarch by George Eliot.
Wow.
And George Lewis plays this pivotal role between each of these 3 lady novelists.
There were so many things in your book that I had no idea about. And one was that Jane Austen had written 3 novels by the end of the 18th century, and no one wanted them. And so a decade later, they were still unpublished, which I thought, wow. I mean, you think of today, that agent really made a mistake. Well, maybe not at the time.
There's always those stories. I mean, imagine everyone who turned down Harry Potter.
Yes, they must be absolutely kicking themselves, those ones.
But she wrote a book called Susan, which she finally did sell for £10 in 1803, but the publisher inexplicably didn't publish it. And so that was unpublished. And she finally buys back the copyright for the same £10 that she sold it for. And she rewrites it a little bit. So after she dies, that's published posthumously. And she's written Persuasion at that point, but it's not called Persuasion, it's called The Eliots. And so her brother finds these 2 manuscripts in her desk after she's died. And he renames them, and he chooses the names brilliantly. So
He did, yeah.
Susan he calls Northanger Abbey, very Gothic, a fantastic parody of all those Gothic bestsellers.
Yes.
And the Eliots he calls Persuasion, and they're both published together.
And then First Impressions ended up being Pride and Prejudice, and Eleanor and Marianne, which is not a great title, it was Sense and Sensibility. He paid for Sense and Sensibility to be published, didn't he?
Yeah, and she was so tenacious, and she reworked and she reworked, and she wrote in this tiny space with very little privacy. And it's fascinating if you think she's writing in a world where the house is much smaller than you think. Then it was much muddier, much busier. The stagecoach went right outside the front door. The windows would all rattle when the stagecoach went past. And she was writing where people were visiting. And so a lot of her concentration in that book, in all her books, is fantastic sense of space and what she can do herself. And then George Eliot's far more expansive, and George Eliot by then is able to travel much more easily. She can catch the train, she can go across the continent, she goes to Switzerland, Germany, Italy. Neither of them had children. If you're going to be a lady novelist, if you're going to survive, not having children was then quite an advantage for an author. And Jane Austen was proposed to a couple of times, and one of the men who proposed to her went off and had 10 children. And I think as a mother to 10 children, we probably wouldn't have heard of Jane Austen, the novelist.
If they had met, how do you think they would have got on with each other?
Oh, I think they would have had a fantastic time together. I think that Jane Austen would have made George Eliot given her much more glamorous clothes to wear, because George Eliot was famously very dowdy, very self-deprecating. Jane Austen loved fashion. She loved the caps she was wearing, the dresses, the sleeves. I think Jane Austen would have been amazed by the freedom that George Eliot had and the ability to go off with George Lewis for a start.
Yes.
I think that if George Eliot had met Jane Austen, she would have explored the psychological territory a little bit more. So Jane Austen often blanks things by saying, I don't want to write about that. I'll leave that for other people to write about. I consider that to be odious, was her expression. She was expecting a marriage proposal, and she talks about it in some of her letters to Cassandra, and it never came. And the one marriage proposal which did come, she accepted it. She was 27 at the time. She accepted it, and they all celebrated, and it was a young man called Harris Big Withers, and he was the younger brother of one of her best friends. But then the next morning she said, I'm sorry, I can't go through this. She rescinded it. And I think George Eliot would want to know what happened that night, what was the thought process, or just what was going on there. Because Jane Austen, I think, at one point really was in the marriage market. All her letters talk about, we had an exceedingly good ball last night. I danced 20 dances without any fatigue. She was clearly the life and soul of the party. And then through her letters, there are fewer and fewer mentions of the lines of men waiting to dance with her. And she began to realise that she would stay single. And I think that she went up to London a few times. She stayed very close to where we are now with her brother Henry. And again, the librarian of the Prince Regent tried to get her to come and stay with him in what he called his halfway house in Golden Square.
Yes.
Which, given that he knew that she was staying with her brother, this was a very veiled invitation to seduce her. And she turned this down. She didn't want this. But she had a life in London which was separate from the life in Hampshire. And there's very intoxicating accounts of her being driven around in a barouche in Hyde Park. And she said she'd laughed all the time. She couldn't believe her luck. Here she was. She'd just got some money from Pride and Prejudice. So she'd come into money for the first time. She'd gone shopping in the West End. And she was just loving life. Then, of course, sadly, she gets, we don't know what disease she died of. It was a sort of lupus or Hodgkin's disease.
And it was the treatment, wasn't it?
Tragically, she gets this terrible disease and she starts treating herself with mercury. And in those days, if you were sick, having had mercury, that was thought to be fantastic because you were purging yourself of whatever you had. And she got sicker and sicker and the mercury was poisoning her. And she dies tragically young, aged 41.
If you were off on one of your trips to somewhere very remote and you got stuck in a snow cave somewhere and you could only have one of their books with you, it's a horrible question because it's
such a desert island question.
It's a desert island, yeah. Which book would you choose?
Well, very unfashionably, I would choose Romola. So she wrote Romola. She knew it was going to be her most difficult book to write. So she actually breaks off writing it quite early and she writes Silas Marner, which is a perfect gem of a book. But in Romola, it's set in 1492 in Florence. So Lorenzo Medici has just died. So there's a papal election and intrigue. Savonarola is there, the bonfire of the vanities are happening. It opens with this extraordinary open where a shipwrecked stranger is lying on a street in Florence, asleep. And he wakes up and there's a man looking right down at him. And within days, this man on the street has got a ring, he's got a secret. And he gets taken up into society and he ends up marrying Romola, but he's very, very treacherous. And it's a story which is a love story, a spy story, a thriller, political thriller. And it's all set in Florence. And she went there and she sort of paced out exactly where she wanted all the characters to go. So she blends these historical figures with fictitious figures. And there's an amazing scene where the treacherous anti-hero is escaping from the mob and he's being chased by a mob down. One's at one end of the street, one's at the other. He's been caught in the middle. And so he takes off his money belt. He throws gems and jewels and money into the mob to try and distract them. He's on the Ponte Vecchio, but they're still coming after him. So he dives. It's like a scene out of James Bond. He dives off the Ponte Vecchio into the River Arno to escape. And he's done it several times. He's escaped. So you think he's going to escape. And then he gets washed up on the shores of the river and his arch enemy is waiting for him.
We need to read the book.
You have to read the book.
Okay, so for all the books, that's the one I should read.
Romola, yes.
Romola, okay. I loved what the American author Henry James said about George Eliot. He said, "The one marvel yet of my stay is having finally seen Mrs. Lewis. I was immensely impressed, interested and pleased. To begin with, she is magnificently ugly, deliciously hideous. Now in this vast ugliness resides a most powerful beauty, which in a very few minutes steals forth and charms the mind so that you end as I ended, falling in love with her. Yes, behold me literally in love with this great horse-faced blue stocking. I don't know in what the charm lies, but it is thoroughly potent. So anyway, I read that and I thought that is a real lesson to internet daters, that it's not all about the way that you look.
She was fantastically self-deprecating, and she talks about sitting for a portrait, and you'll be so amused to hear that I'm sitting for a portrait because why would anyone want to paint me? It's so touching, but she had such reservoirs of empathy and insight that when she was accepted back into society towards the end of her life, people would queue up to sit next to her. And finally, Queen Victoria let it be known that she approved of George Eliot, and she had had some paintings commissioned of scenes from Adam Bede. And so she was part of society, but she had a long life of being an absolute radical and breaking new ground. And I think every 20th century writer would probably refer to George Eliot as a key inspiration. Jane Austen, equally inspiring. I mean, those plots are just incredible for anyone to be able to conjure up. One marriage is hard enough, 2 marriages. By the end, she's conjuring up 5 marriages in a book where every partner has to fall in love with the wrong person at first or think they're in love, and then it all gets reversed. And she can just do it at the flick of the wrist. By the end of the books, everything is happily sorted out and all 5 marriages fall into line. It's extraordinary writing and
plotting. They're so clever, so astute, and we all love it today. It's because actually the way that we as humans work, it hasn't changed. Society may have changed, the rules may have changed, but the way that we fundamentally are and behave and what we long for, it's all the same. It's all the same, and first impressions are often wrong, and you've got the antennae are so sensitive, and the same rules apply now, but in those days, the faintest pressure on the tip of your fingers when you're handing someone into a carriage could imply all sorts of different things. If you bowed your head, if you just touched your hat rather than taking your hat off, these were sending signals. So in Pride and Prejudice, Darcy just touches his hat to Wickham, and all the women go, what's the meaning of that? It's impossible not to wish to know what's going on. So there's very subtle signals, and nowadays I'm sure there's antennae just picking up different signals but in the same implication. Yes, I loved what you said in the last paragraph about the 2 authors touching their fingers across the bookshelves of their fictional world. It was a joy of a book. Please may we end with a quotation from your Gerald Durrell's Army book. So full circle back to conservation. Gerald says, many people think that conservation is just saving fluffy animals. What they don't realise is that conservation is a war to prevent the human race from committing suicide. And you write about a chemistry change that's required to stop us destroying ourselves. Could you explain what you mean by that? Yes, I think we all need to have hope, and you get your hope from understanding other people and from listening to their stories and listening to their life battles and being part of those life battles. And so we can be here in London and we know that someone like Panima in India is saving a stork from extinction. She's got 20,000 women now helping her on this extraordinary journey she's on. So that's a part of just changing chemistry. And the fantastic thing is the stork's not in isolation. So she's not just saving a stork from extinction. What she, of course, is really doing as well with 20,000 women is helping change a community. So she's talking to them about their health, how safe they are at home, any problems they're facing. So this is a forum to change a community as well. So the stork is on one level, but everything else she's doing is working on another level. So I think changing the chemistry like that means if we can be part of that, we can help save ourselves as well as saving the stork and the penguins and everything else which lies in between. Wow, you're doing the most amazing job. Please keep inspiring us and educating us and entertaining us. Thank you, Edward. I've had such a lovely time. Thank you so, so much. Well, thank you, Katie. I think you have a fantastic way of bringing out the best in people and sharing everyone's stories. So that gives us all hope as well. So a reminder, Edward's book is called Jane Austen and George Eliot, The Lady and the Radical, and it's a fascinating read, whether or not you are familiar with their novels. It's just out and it's great. You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B, Head of Marketing, to all of the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.